What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Lacrosse Flash Mock Draft Roundtable. My name's Teddy Jenner, joined, of course, by the handsome one, Pat Gregoire, and Chief Editor Beast, Austin Owens. Lads, how are we?
Doing good. Any day that we get to talk about actual lacrosse things inside the box. No offense to the PLL. Been enjoying the PLL, but it's good to talk finally about some NLL action.
Absolutely.
It's good to be home. That's all I'm going to say. Lacrosse is back.
We've all been at some practices here and there. We're starting to get the bug again. As we lead into the draft, it's sort of the first real sign of the off season leading into free agency, so we can get excited. Obviously, Panther City Lacrosse Club will be doing their draft later today. We want to kind of give you our thoughts on what the Lax Flash staff feel are the likely scenarios that Bob Hamley and his staff will go towards. We'll give you some dark horses and maybe a few other picks, but we kind of have an idea, but most likely we're going to be way off on a lot of them. That's why we're called experts. So let's hop into it. Austin, as a first-year club, Panther City obviously wants to make a splash. What do you think their game plan is going to be in going into this draft?
It could be one of two things, honestly. It could be sort of, I think New York sort of took, and Rochester took two different avenues when you look at it. I mean, Rochester went with the Sean Evans and the Curtis Knights of the world and added those, star talents of the draft. When you look at New York, they added like the Connor Kellys, the Kieran McCardles, the guys that you could also market and build around. So I'd say it's one of those two avenues. I don't know if there's the same kind of star talent out there as Sean Evans or Curtis Knight or something like that when it comes to forwards this year. So maybe you go younger. I think a mix of the two is probably what they want to go with here. Grab some pieces that have, high ceilings and can prove themselves and build with the team and build your core for the next couple of years. But you also want, a couple of those guys that you can build your core around and some leaders in the locker room to lead those guys that you're going to groom for the future.
Patty, what do you think they've learned from watching Philadelphia, San Diego, New York, Rochester? What errors can they try to avoid, and what things can they learn?
I think they have to realize that there's no perfect formula, or at least there hasn't been a team to figure it out. You got to get your young guys because, let's be honest, it's going to be difficult to build a championship contender right out the gate. I think everyone just assumed with the Vegas Golden Knights in the NHL, with the way expansion draft works in modern sports, they're going to be able to jump in and make a champion. Well, clearly that hasn't been the case so far with the NL, but there have been some competitive teams. And I think so far, a lot of those teams that have been competitive out the gate have done a good job finding that blend of young, promising talent with high ceilings and also mixing in some veterans as well. Because as you know, in the National Lacrosse League, you need those guys to be in the locker room at practice, knowing what it takes to be a pro and knows what goes into being a National Lacrosse League player. But with that being said, Austin nailed it as well. You need some marketable players as well. So you need to pick up maybe some guys that don't have quite the amount of box lacrosse experience, but maybe they have a little bit more, more notoriety in the field lacrosse game, in the PLL, or maybe in college. So I think they got to figure out a blend and maybe not too worry about so much of a strategy rather than just looking at the board. Who are the best players available? Let's get a little bit defense here. Let's get a little bit of offense, a little young, a little old, and kind of just mesh that in as a perfect melting pot.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a mix of young, old goaltenders, guys that are soon to be free agents, maybe even the odd guy that hasn't even played a game in the National Lacrosse League yet. Obviously, free agency is going to be a big thing for this club, and we're going to briefly touch on this because it does play an effect in what they're going to do and who they're going to draft. Austin, you mentioned there may not be a lot of star power or cachet names in the draft, but in free agency, there might be the odd guy that really lures Bob Hamley to take a stab at him once August 1st hits.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see because you have, a lot of these teams took the strategy of taking that risk and putting those guys that are UFAs. When you look at, the big one for us, I believe, is Cody Jamieson. He was a guy that was left your veterans that you take a swing at and say, these guys aren't going to be taken. We'll take a chance and hope they make it to free agency because we know we'll be able to get them back. So maybe some of those guys don't come back. I know, last offseason, Callum Crawford was the big signing for New York. So maybe it's not this year even, but this year is going to be a big year for Panther City because they only have 13 guys on their roster. They got to fill that roster out somehow. So it's going to be through the draft. It's going to be through free agency. I'll be interested to see what happens because you don't really know because it's not out west, it's down south. So it might be a little interesting depending on where some guys are located to see where they end up. I'll be sort of interested in, those UFAs that don't end up getting picked, what they end up doing because they have to go somewhere at this point. It might not be the team they were with last season.
So for fans, just, if you're unsure, players 30 years and older are unrestricted free agents if they've been in the league for 6 years. But if you're over the age of 34, you can restrict the franchise tag. So while you're looking at those unprotected lists, yes, there's some really big names there, but a lot of those really big names, Cody Jameson, you mentioned, Ryan Benesh, some of those guys are unrestricted free agents who can reject the tag. So we're probably not going to see those types of guys get drafted, maybe in free agency. However, there are some dark horses in this. And while the cachet names may not be there, there are some names that might have some sex appeal to them, Patrick.
Absolutely. I think I already mentioned it with, grabbing those guys that don't exactly have the box lacrosse pedigree that some of these names that are more household for us that follow the Canadian ranks, in senior as well. But a name that really is intriguing for me is Michael Sowers. And I think he's a guy that does have a little bit of box lacrosse experience. I talked about it a little bit in our NLL Q&A earlier today, but he's a guy that, you look at Albany's roster, and yes, there are some picks that really jump out off the board. Johnny Pearson, Jean-Luc Chetner, a guy who also kind of fits in this is Adam Kitchen. And I really, really think that Kitchen is a guy that sorry, not Adam Kitchen. Charlie Kitchen. Yes, exactly. Charlie Kitchen. There's another Adam Kitchen, Green Gale. Anyways, Charlie Kitchen. He's a guy that I think is very intriguing. He played a year with the Toronto Beaches, had a very, very solid year, but it was just the 1 year. And I know that Albany's very high on him, obviously with his coaching staff there, seeing a lot of him. But with that being said, he's a guy that, again, only 1 year box under his experience, but that 1 year was very solid. Same thing with Sowers, played in that Connecticut box league and looked very good, but that's not the National Lacrosse League. But what we've seen from him, the sky's the limit. If he can figure out the boxing game, a Grant Ament, same thing. We know how good he is in the field game. Can he do that inside the box? I don't know. Would you rather take a stab at a guy whose ceiling is super high and you don't know that maybe he can become a superstar? Or do you go with a guy, no offense to Jean-Luc Chetner or Johnny Pearson, their ceilings aren't nearly as high, but you know what you're getting with them. Those are two very solid pros, and they're going to come in night out and be able to contribute right away. But whereas those other guys, those other names, maybe not right away, but eventually if they do hit that stride, there's a chance you just got a diamond in the rough.
Yeah, I think quick shout out to US Boxla and the College Box Lacrosse League. They're starting to produce guys.
Yes.
And we've seen what Trevor Baptiste has done. Mac O'Keefe has spent some time in the Canadian League playing some lacrosse as an American. And we're going to start seeing more of those guys. And I think the guys, even just dabbling in it for a season, is going to give them a step ahead of anybody that comes in as an American without that just even understanding what it's like to get hit into the boards or take a chop when you don't have the ball. That really goes a long way in helping these young kids understand the box game. And I really do like that point that there are probably a few Americans that are enticing to Bob Hamley and his staff to take it, not a flyer on, but to give that guy an actual shot and pick him up in this draft. Audie, do you got any dark horses or guys that you look at those rosters and think, you know what? He may not be my number one or number two guy, but if you really want to go deep, this is a guy.
I'm a big fan of Adam Kitchen as well, honestly. Just Charlie's a guy that we were really high on in the draft, and he's a guy that we like to highlight. I think we had one of his photos at Delaware that I think was really funny. He's sort of a character, which I kind of like. Yeah. Another guy I'm looking at that's kind of interesting for Georgia is Lane Hruska, goalie that was taken very high last year, and the goalie class, not to put down anybody, but the goalies are either unrestricted free agents or not proven starters at the moment. So you're taking a chance on a guy that's either young or you're taking a chance on, a Steve Fryer or a Ty Carlson, a guy that can step in and be your stopgap until you find the future guy. And that's not a bad thing. That's what you need for some teams. The Lane Hruska is really interesting. 13th overall pick. I mean, he was supposed to come over and play junior A last summer before everything stopped. So I'm very interested to see. I'm sure Georgia's very interested to see what happens as well, because there's a very good chance they're going to lose a goalie in this expansion draft. So I mean, with Vegas coming as well, I think they could lose 2 goalies in the next 2 expansion tracks. So
yeah, Evan Traminor made that point. Yeah, a really good point about that in his article. That sure, you might lose Kevin Orleman, you might lose Lane Rushka, but you might lose one of those guys next year as well. So it's a bit of a pick your poison situation for a lot of these teams when it comes to the goaltender position.
Yeah, I'll give some love to my goalies though, and I'll stick with Lane.
Yeah, fair enough. We talked a little free agency. We've talked dark horses. One of the big things we always kind of talk about when it comes to expansion drafts, and we see them every time there is one, is the old pick and flip, where a guy is going to get drafted and then he's immediately flipped back to his former team for assets, current players, anything like that. I'm sure we're going to expect them. Is there one that is more likely than the other, Pat?
I don't know if there's one more likely than the other, but I know that probably the most intriguing one would be Chris Corbeil, because I think when you look at all the names, he's the name that jumps off the board for me the most. Obviously, you would absolutely love to convince him to come down to the Lone Star State, have him as your captain, lead that young team. But with that being said, he's been in this league for a long time. He's a proven winner. He earns that respect to say, I respect getting picked, but I decline. I'm going to sit out. So maybe that's an opportunity where you see he sits out, or maybe this is just going to be, Hamley's going to see a situation where I'm going to draft him. I know he's not going to report. I'm going to then either try to flip him back to Saskatchewan, or if Saskatchewan's price, isn't matched, then you go out to the market and see all these championship contenders, because let's be honest, who in their right mind would not want Chris Corbeil on their back end in that locker room? So he's a guy that I think right away, you don't even really necessarily, I think he's the guy that probably jumps off the page. You use that franchise tag, which obviously comes into play as well, which we haven't talked about yet. But I think he's a guy that easily you could get a ton of draft picks back. You probably could get maybe the other guy or other couple of guys that you were thinking about as well too. So that's something interesting that we don't know what's going to happen. We'll have to wait until, this all unfolds. But definitely interesting to say the least.
I think the one thing about the Corbeil situation is that he's 33 now. So Saskatchewan or whoever gets him is only going to have him as a UFA for 1 year. Then he becomes a UFAR, so he can go anywhere and he can reject a franchise tag. So I don't know if he has as much value going back to Saskatchewan as, say, when San Diego took Brett Mitski and flipped him back to Saskatchewan and got 4 picks for him. But I do believe Chris Corbeil, will pull in a hefty price tag in return from whoever wants him if Panther City does take him. Audie, sorry, Pat, you want to say something?
I was just going to say, and I think that's also the intriguing thing as well, because even if Saskatchewan says, you know what, we're ready to cut ties, there's going to be 3-4 other teams knocking at the door, because that's where you're going to have to give up a ton of assets, but it's just for that 1 year. And for a team, let's just say Halifax, that they're going into next year, it's championship or bust for them. So there's a lot of other teams, even a team like Philadelphia, they're ready, they're knocking at the door, they want to become a championship team. How do you push yourself over to becoming a championship team? You get one of the best leaders in the league. You get a very solid transition player in Chris Corbeil, and you're going to have to give a lot for him. But I think, that's why Panther City's in the driver's seat and they can do a move like that. But they can also just not go about that as well. And there's some pretty other good players that are available out of that list too.
Audie?
I'm going to go a different route, but I'm pretty sure just a quick thing on Corbeil, because he's 33 now. I think what we were talking about before this was next year, I think, for the R status, I think he at I can't think of words right now. I don't know how to speak CBA. I'm sorry. I think it's determined his R status by the year, like the start of the year for January 1st rather than. So I think he turns into a UFAR in 23 because he'd still be 33 at the start of the year.
So you might get him for 1 or 2 years.
Yeah. Regardless, you're getting him for 1 or 2 years. You might not get him for any years. You might flip him back to Sask or somewhere else, as Pat was saying. You might be able to get more from somebody else, honestly, because, Derek Keenan's sort of seen what Chris Corbeil can do, and Chris Corbeil's a hell of a ball player, but you sort of you have a fondness with the guy, but you're not going to overpay to get a guy back that even if he's won you 3 championships. So the guy I'm going to go with is Dan Coates. I think he's sort of the other main guy that I'm sure we'll be talking about when we get to the Swarm section of this, but it's such an interesting case for me because they traded one of the stars in lacrosse and Zed Williams to get him the Georgia Swarm, and he might not even play a game for them.
Yeah.
And that's a rough look, and you can never account for something like COVID happening, obviously, but in hindsight, like, it's tough. Having said that, if you take, say, a Dan Coates, you franchise tag him and you flip him back to Georgia, because Georgia always likes to trade for top 10 picks. That's their favorite thing in the world other than winning championships. And somehow they fell ass backwards into a 3rd overall pick this year, I believe. So maybe you do something like that. That might be a little rich for the Georgia guys, but maybe you do something like that. Or same thing with Corbeil. If you have your eyes on another guy, maybe you package a pick and get the guy you actually want.
Right.
If they're desperate to get back a guy. I think that's sort of how you have to play chess in that situation.
Patty? I think, and that's the difficult choice, and that's the choice that Bob Hamley is going to have to make too. It's because you also look at that list. You already mentioned the 2 goaltenders that are available, but there's also some other good names there as well. Connor Sellers. There's a lot of other really intriguing names that you want to take there. So do you go the route with the franchise tag, or maybe do you grab a goalie that has the potential to be a number 1 down the road in a Kevin Orleman, or you get a young guy in Lane Rushka, or you get a great, position player, or, you grab that and then you talk to Dan Coates come August 1st, and then you sign him in free agency. And I think that might be maybe the road that Bob Hamlin might take. And we talked, about you have to have those veteran guys in the lineup. Well, he is a perfect guy that you want to have around those young guys. So I think that if you can go that route without having to use that franchise tag, acquire a potential number 1 goalie, that's probably the best case scenario that you can do. But you also have to be convinced come August 1st, you're going to be able to convince Coatsy to sign up and come down to Fort Worth.
He's got a pretty good relationship with Bob Hamley, so I think he'll be okay. He's a former captain of the Colorado Mammoth. He understands what it takes. It would be a great fit. Before we get sort of into our picks, other than Corbeil or Coates, because those are sort of the main focus ones, if it's not even Coates or Corbeil because he can reject it, is there a guy out there that you would want to take in this draft as a UFAR, pick them, select them, and automatically franchise other than Dan Coates?
Paul Rabel.
You're an idiot.
I don't think he's got status. I just needed to throw a name out there.
We already know he's going to Vegas in next year's expansion.
I was going to say the seeds are already being planted.
Yeah, just pencil that in.
Put the tinfoil hat on. The conspiracies are already up.
But I think we can all agree there's probably nobody other than Dan Coates that's out there that is worth a pick just so that you can franchise him.
Yeah, I don't
think so, because I think just the other guys that are out there, I think you can build enough through this draft to get that solid core of young guys and the veteran guys. And the intriguing thing with this year as well is that a lot of guys last year heading into the season that did get cut short, there's UFAs everywhere. There's restricted free agents everywhere as well. So if you can't get something done right now, that doesn't mean that there's, in a couple of weeks, when the clock turns to August 1st, you're not going to be able to make a move for a restricted guy, or you're not going to be able to sign someone as well. So I think the main focus right now is probably try to get one of those guys, whether you try to get them, flip them for picks, and then assess the situation once August comes first, where you can now actually start talking to free agents.
Are you laughing or are you dying, Audie?
I'm choking.
Oh, if your bolo's too tight. You got to lose the bolo.
I'm so excited. I'm choking on water right now.
Yeah. All right. Let's jump into it. We got 13 players to choose. We'll just kind of go alphabetically through this. Makes it simple. As we know, there's no other team, so Albany or Panther City's not picking against anybody. So easiest just to go A through V. Albany Blackwolf. No, Albany Firewolves. Patty. We have a feeling who it might be, but who are we as the LAC Flash Lax Flash taken.
We're going to go with Johnny Pearson, but I think I've already discussed the other guys that are definitely potentials to be grabbed. But you just look at Pearson, freak athlete, big body, can play both sides of the ball. And we know the way the game is going. The more guys that you can have that are versatile, that can go back in transition or push the ball up in transition, it's very big. He's also a guy that is already down in the States, so he can be one of those guys that you can bring in right away and start growing the game at the grassroots level as well. So I like him, the former Buckeye. I think he's a guy that's going to fit in well with this team, and I think that he's a guy that certainly a lot of teams would like to take a stab at.
6'4", 220, and a big shot left-handed. That's not easy to find. That's why I had him at the top of my list. Buffalo, Audie, there's a lot here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talent here, and a lot of that talent is on the defensive end of the ball, and that's what an expansion team is going to need.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see because, you have Nick Weiss, you've got Liam Patton, you've got Matt Spanger, excuse me. All these different guys that aren't exactly, the top guys. They're not the Priolos. They're not the guys that are going to really steal headlines. Ethan O'Connor's another one. That's another good piece. We're going with Nick Weiss. That was the one that sort of came up with all of us. I don't think you can really go wrong with Buffalo. I think they're one of the most underrated defensive units in the league. Weiss just sort of brings a lot to the table, and he's sort of I don't want to say the guy out of that group that you think of first when it comes to defenders, but he's certainly a guy that a lot of good people that know a lot about the sport have a lot of good things to say about. So I don't think he's 6'4". I don't think he's got a Johnny Pearson build, and you can't teach size, obviously, but he'll fit in just fine on that defense, and he's been around a long time, so he'll know how to sort of carry himself and work within the defensive unit right away.
I think one thing that we haven't really talked about, but is often an underlying factor in a lot of these drafts, is familiarity. Yeah. And for Tracy Kluski, Steve Toll, and that coaching staff with Dan Teat, it's going to be picking guys that they know, whether from coaching them in junior, coaching them in the summer league, whatever it may be. I think having that familiarity will be huge. Nick Weiss has played for Tracy Kluski at the Peterborough Lakers, so that is a very good connection. Calgary, we kind of flip a lot on. This is another group that could go either way, but I think we landed on Patrick Dodds mostly just because of his raw natural ability. But it might not be Dodds, but we feel like Dodds, right, Audie?
Yeah, I was fully down to let you describe it because he's the good old Victoria boy. I
didn't want to get called a homer.
No,
let's go Patrick Dodds. He is an absolute monster. He's still only 19, 20 years old, so he still has a lot of room to grow into that big body. He's got soft hands. He gets the net really well, but he hasn't played a single game in the National Lacrosse, and that's probably going to be the one deterrent to him. But if what we kind of speculate is going to be true, and the fact that a lot of those early first-round draft picks of this year's coming up draft are going to go back to school, if you can get a young forward like a Patrick Dodds, who is a second-round draft pick, and get him into your system right away, a big shot right-hander, I think it is a very natural choice, and a guy that you can really build an offense around, but he doesn't have to be that number one guy. He's still going to be a young guy growing, but we looked at a guy like Anthony Kalinic. We looked at a guy like Liam LeClaire, even Marshall with 1L King. Has got
Mitch Wild too,
and Mitch Wild, and I love Mitch Wild. I actually had Chad Cummings up top of my list. He's 28, played some hockey. The guy is just an absolute animal. And out of those handful of guys, you're not going to go wrong. We just like Dodds for the prospect and the fact that he is going to be a young future for that team as a right-hander.
And I think just with him, it's just you just see that ceiling. You know what Mitch Wild is. You have an idea what Chad Cummins is. Obviously, there's some other options that are younger guys, but you would just be kicking yourself if you're Bob Hanley and Tracy Kluski. If you see in 2-3 years to see the player that Patrick Dodds can become, knowing you had a chance at that, because those other players, you know what you're getting. But with Patrick Dodds, you said enough about him. The guy has the potential to be a very special player.
Now, here's one that I think a lot of people outside of Colorado had penciled in. But everybody inside Colorado is praying that it's not him, and that is Lightning Joey Capito. And Pat, you brought up the fact when we were talking about this beforehand that for an expansion franchise, you need electricity. You need guys who are going to spark the fans, give them somebody to cheer for, make them a fan favorite. We've seen what he's done in Denver. He's a 2-time transition player of the year. Joey Capito really seems like a natural fit.
He should be. And obviously there's been some chatter, some rumblings that maybe this is not the way they go. But if I'm Bob Hamlin, I'm making sure I can grab him and bring him down to Fort Worth at Dickey's Arena because, one, first off, former football player. Football's pretty popular down there, I've heard. So, but no, he's an electric player. I mean, they literally call him Lightning for a reason. You have him on the floor. People are going to absolutely fall in love with him, and they're going to fall in love with the game. We already know they're going to fall in love with the game, but it's players like him that the casual lacrosse fans that's just learning about the game, he's the guy that really attracts people. He's the guy that keeps you on the edge of your seat. And I think if you have an opportunity to bring in a guy like that also, let's be honest, who's their defensive coordinator? Steve Toll.
One of the best ever.
He knew how to run the ball up the floor. He knew how to score goals in transition. I can guarantee you he's going to want to play fast and furious. Why not grab a guy who right now in the game is one of the best transition players in the game?
Audie, we talked Georgia a little bit, and we've talked they could go Dan Coates as a UFA and franchise him, but we'll probably wait till August 1st. We've mentioned Ruska. We've mentioned Kevin Orleman, 2 young goaltenders who really haven't had a chance yet, especially Lane. But we like the fact that Kevin Orleman has minutes. He's played at top levels in Canada, and he's ready to be that guy.
Yeah, if you talk about a guy that's, paying your dues is sort of something that's not exactly shine a light on, I should say. But he's paid his dues. I think he's been a backup goalie, it seems, for 4 or 5 years now at this point. He sat behind Mike Poulin, and you're not going to start Kevin Orleman over Mike Poulin. He's one of the best in the game, and he's up there for one of the best of all time. Not the best, obviously, but his career really says all it needs to. But yeah, Orleman put in the minutes. I know he's played with KW and now Coburg for the last couple of summers. So, he's got those minutes where he's been able to put in time and, see pro shooters, see what they do, gain their tendencies. And, he's been a guy that's been very highly touted for a long time now. It's not like he's come out of nowhere and just become this hot commodity. He's a guy that people were looking at when he got drafted as somebody that could be the future for the Georgia Swarm when Poulin was into his 30s. So, yeah, we talked about Ruska. We talked about Coates. I think Coates would be an unreal ad, but the fact that we talked about before, I think it's a bit of a rolling of the dice. And if you go with, say, a Corbeil or you go with a Capito, do you need a Dan Coates? It'd be nice, but goaltending is really what wins you games when you look at it. You saw in New York last year, you could win or lose games with your play in net. So, it's tough because I think Georgia sort of grabbed Ruska with the idea that they'd have, both the Orleman brothers. Obviously, Steven went to New York. So now it's kind of the situation we talked about. You could lose Lane the next year too, and you'll be looking for the next guy to replace Cooley after he's done. But yeah, I think the other guy we have down in net that we'll talk about in a little bit, I think he and Orleman sort of create that 1-2 punch that you get really excited about as a team that's growing for the future.
I think it's funny. We kind of mentioned it, but I forgot about Steven Orleman. Like Georgia could lose 3 goaltenders in the span of 2.5 years when they had the deepest goaltender pool of any team in the league, and they could just be stuck with Mike Poulin after the Vegas draft.
Yeah, I think they have no choice but next year to protect Lane.
Yeah,
he may not even play a game, and that's just, you don't want to be caught with no one, because I mean Mike Poulin, it seems like every year he's toying with hanging him up, but then he ends up still being one of the best goalies in the league. And so, I mean, the guy could still play for a couple of years, but at the same time, Orleman goes, another Orleman goes, and then if Rushka goes, then you're really in trouble. So, but this year, I think if Kevin Orleman's going to be there, I think you have to take him. And like you said, we've already alluded to maybe another goalie being there. With Vegas coming in, say if one of these goalies that, do take command, now all of a sudden you've got some trade bait saying, listen, hey, Vegas, we've got another guy here if you want to pick up. So now if that other guy potentially takes over, you have a trade piece there for you as well.
You probably have to leave the second guy unprotected for the
Yeah,
Vegas
or you just leave them unprotected.
No,
and
it's going to be crazy. We talk about the depth of goaltending in this league and how it needs to continue to grow. We need more goaltenders. The goaltender carousel in the next few years is going to be very interesting to watch as some of those older guys become UFAs and may want to move, and some of the younger guys finally start to get their feet wet because, we haven't even mentioned guys like Landon Kells or Dunkerley. Rylan Hartley is going to be in Rochester now. We're going to talk about Craig Wendy in a minute and even Nick DeMood, but we're starting to see that next young crop of goaltenders come through. Halifax, your backyard, Patty. We know it's not going to be Cody Jamieson. Ryan Benesh is out there in a very intriguing pick, but probably not just age where he is in his career. He hasn't played in 2 years. How's his body holding up? But they have some young offensive talent and some really good young defensive product who are definitely on Bob Hamley's radar.
I think this one first, maybe even before this happened, pretty much from when we found out that Panther City was coming in, I had Chris Boucher circled as a guy, excuse me, that they were going to lose right away, just because he's a guy that has proven, when he had his little stint with the Roughnecks, produced. Rochester, produced. Came in to Halifax, just kind of got stuck behind some studs on that, left-hand side. Just so many very good righties. But when he got in, he still scored. So I was thinking, absolutely he's going to get in. But then you look at the other names, and the guy that we went with was Ethan Riggs. And Riggs is a guy that, again, you haven't seen him play in the National Lacrosse League, but you look at his body of work in other leagues, whether it be with, the Burlington Chiefs in Junior A or in the Arena Lacrosse League where he's actually playing against grown men. This is a guy that, Billy D. Smith said he is Graham Hossick without the offensive upside, his potential. That's what it is. Wow. That's pretty high praises, and that's not just coming from anyone. That's coming from a tough, hard-nosed defender in Billy D. So that he's not going to just say that for anything. So they obviously had to, because if you look at their defense, they had to leave someone unprotected. Mm-hmm. So with Riggs is there, he's a young kid. Like I said, he's big, he's huge, he's strong, he's mean. He's continuing to get better, and he's intriguing, very similar to a guy like Graham Hossick. He started in Junior C, then went up to Junior B, and then went up to Junior A. So, but it's all year after year after year. So if you can see him, how quickly his trajectory to where he is now, how quickly he's getting better, it's only going to continue to go up. So his learning curve is going to take a while, but with a team like Panther City, they have time to have some patience for Ethan Riggs. And Steve Toole, again, he probably would be foaming at the mouth to get a big, hard-nosed defender in their lineup.
We move on to New York, a team that has a very deep, unprotected player pool, but it's not exactly a flashy one. Pardon the pun. But it's like we talked about. There's not a lot of cachet names on this list, but there are two guys that have very strong American ties, and that's Kieran McArdle and Connor Kelly. And we kind of flip-flop back and forth. And I know, Audie, I'm going to let you have your moment and say you're not a big Kieran McArdle fan. But you really like what Connor Kelly can bring.
So I don't want to throw Kieran McArdle under the bus.
Not saying you are. I'm just saying
I know.
Biggest fan.
I know. Because I've seen him fight in person and he can throw. So I definitely am not trying to poke the bear there. So Don't get me wrong. I think when you look at it with them, Kieran McArdle has been in the NLL for probably 4 or 5 years now, I'd say, probably closer to 5 with the Rock. And I think he's sort of hit his ceiling, with all due respect to him, of like what you're going to see from him. And that's fine. He's getting towards 30s, 27, 28-ish now. You don't expect a guy to take a huge jump from what he was. Yeah. What he is a fantastic shooter from the outside. He can sting the ball, as can most field guys. The issue is, I think, his shot selection. He likes to take a lot of shots from really high up in the zone and sometimes even as close to the restraining line. So that's where I think you could probably get a better player and a younger player that's more of a sponge and can learn the box game. And I think that's why we went with Connor Kelly. One of the faces of Maryland lacrosse a couple of years ago. He's a guy that's really shown that he can be a solid contributor in the PLL. And he's a guy that's shown that he's interested in playing in the NLL, which is, the first step, I think, for most American guys is actually committing to playing box. And, you're going to take licks and you're going to get hit. And Connor Kelly stands in there and takes it. And I think he's not like a 90-point guy. Let's not get it confused here. But, 50 to 60 points, I could see that within the right offense with the right guys. More towards 50, but 60 would be unbelievable if you get him in the expansion draft. But yeah, I think he's sorry to cut you off there, Teddy. I think he's sort of the same reason New York went with him. I think he's a great marketing piece just because he was a Tewaaraton finalist.
Yeah.
And he's just a guy you can build around and could sort of like a Matt Rambo. He can have that same sort of sneaky production where you don't necessarily Rambo sticks out obviously because he's Matt frickin' Rambo. But Thick Boy Summers well and alive. Shout out to him. But Connor Kelly can go out and just sort of give you a nice, not quiet, but solid sort of quiet 50 to 60 points. That would be, you're laughing if you're Bob Hanley.
Yeah. I think we were all surprised that he was left unprotected.
Yeah. almost 40 points, in his first year with the Riptide. So kind of surprising to see him there, but why not? Why not take a stab at him? Again, Audie, you nailed it. It's all about the ceiling. When it comes to it, these teams know as much as they're going to give you the lip service saying we're going to compete for a championship right away, the reality of it, it's going to take a little while. So why not try to get these guys that you don't know where their ceiling is, but you know where it can potentially be. So I think Kelly has probably the highest ceiling of that list there.
Let's move to Philadelphia. And I mentioned the familiarity of picking players. And you've got guys like Corey Vitorelli, who's a Peterborough guy, so Tracy Kluski will know what he brings to the table. You've got a guy like Alex Krepensek, who's been around this league and is a true grit and glue guy for a young defense. But the fact that Jackson Subak was so highly rated in the draft last year and was left unprotected, and he has really close ties to Steve Toll, having been a Mimico guy and played against him when Toller was coaching St. Catharines. And we know what Jackson Subak can bring. He is a monster. He has toughness. He might be a little thin, but he's going to grow into that body still. But I really like what he brings. And we kind of all agreed that having a young defensive mind that you can mold, that you're familiar with and you're really high on, makes a lot of sense. And I like Jackson Subak going to Panther City, and it's going to be a tough loss if it happens for Philadelphia because I know the Philly fans would absolutely love him. But there are some other intriguing pieces, but we kind of all agreed that Subak just kind of made sense.
Absolutely. I think there, like you said, there's obviously, you'd love to bring in a guy like, Alex Krepensek, as you mentioned, Liam Burns, another American guy that has absolutely embraced the box game. But when you look at it, just Subak, again, it's all about the ceiling. This is a guy that, from the moment I saw him play in junior, this is a guy that you just would absolutely hate to play against, and guys do not want to play against him. He's hard. He's smart. He's not going to put up big numbers in offense, but he's also not going to be a guy that, he's not a pigeon where he's running the ball up the floor and doesn't know what to do. He can get it to your safe space. And the big thing for me, you said it, familiarity. And I think he's going to, and not even just you mentioned with Toll, but Dan Teat coached Brampton all the way up. And those two teams, Mimico and Brampton, were rivals from even before junior, from minor. So he knows how good of a player he is. And I think that it seems too good to be true for Subak to just fall into the lap of Panther City.
We're seeing a lot of big young defenders come into the league and start to have a really good effect. You look at Warren Jeffrey and you look at Brett Craig as two prime examples in Colorado. Just big, hulking, athletic defensemen that really can control a lot of floor space. And that's one of the things I like about Jackson Subak is that he will cover a lot of floor wherever he is. So we've talked about Kevin Orleman, and we're going to get to our other goalie that we've selected, but Rochester has Craig Wendy just sitting there, and he was going head-to-head with Steve Fryer and Rylan Hartley, where Rochester in that first year were running three goaltenders, and it looks like he's going to be the odd man out. And the one thing I completely overlooked about Craig is that the guy's 30, and he's been around the lacrosse world for quite some time. Not exactly in the National Lacrosse League, but he has seen a lot of rubber. And I think, Patty, you might have joked and said he's seen as much rubber as Matt Vince has in the world of lacrosse in the last few years. And it's probably true. He's really been toiling in the senior B leagues, and he's a fantastic goaltender, but I just don't think he's going to be the guy that they take. He could be, but we landed on Doug Udding just for the fact that Udding has a lot of intangibles that he will bring to the table.
Yeah, exactly. And this is probably one of the more intriguing rosters of exposed rosters, I should say, just due to the fact that there isn't that one or two guys that jump off the page saying, this guy is a potential superstar. Or this guy, we really need to have him. But there's a ton of guys on the roster that you would absolutely love to have on your team. We'll get into Doug Iden quickly, but just touching on some other guys, Phil Caputo, a guy that can play both sides of the ball, really hasn't had that opportunity to be a key contributor. Paul Dawson, that's another guy that could potentially be a captain, but obviously he is getting up in age. And Doug Iden is that perfect blend of, like you said, he's a younger guy, but he's also got the intangibles. This is a guy that every time he steps on the floor, he's getting better, getting smarter, and you know what you're getting out of Doug Iden. You're getting 110%. He plays the game right. He's a good pro. All those cliches that you hear all the time, he's a guy that knows how to play. Big team guy, everything.
Big team guy.
So, yes, don't get me wrong. When you're building a team, you need a couple of guys that have potential to be a superstar. You need some old grizzled vets to keep the guys, in the locker room when things aren't going well, to keep everyone together. But at the same time, you need those guys that are the Doug Idings, that are those glue guys that, doesn't matter if you're getting blown out by Saskatchewan or if you're in a dog fight, against San Diego, he's going to give you that same effort night in and night out. And the big thing for me is, like I said, every year, whether it be watching him in Coburg or watching him what he's been able to do with Rochester, he just gets better and better. I'm a big fan of his game.
Audie, we've got Kevin Orleman. We're going to pass on Craig the Tendy Wendy. And from San Diego, we're going to take Nick Demuth, aren't we?
That's what it looks like, Ted. I think when you look at it, I think the main two that we really sort of fought with were Nick Demuth or Casey Jackson was the other one that really stuck out. And I mean, Casey Jackson has the potential to be, a 3 or 4 point a game guy, and he could play a really big role. But I think, as we said with Kevin Orleman, I think goaltending, the class it's not, I don't want to say shallow because that would be doing a disservice to a lot of very good pros, but there's not a lot of guys, like I think I said previously, that can step in and be that guy. And I think you have two sort of standout young guys in Demuth and Kevin Orleman that really play that role. And, unlike Orleman, I think Demuth really had a chance to step in and, be the guy for a couple of games for San Diego in 2019-20 when Frank Chiliano was out for a little while there. He had a good record. I think he had a sub-10 goals against average. And teams noticed that. I mean, it wasn't just a one-game flash, no pun intended there again. But, and we are on brand tonight, boys. Well done. Big team guy in there as well. We're firing. I think over, one game is something. 3 games isn't a flash in the pan. It's not a coincidence. So, a sub-10 goals against average in 3 games is not a lot, but it shows what he can be. And even if he's the backup, he's one hell of a backup to Kevin Orleman because he's only been in the league for a couple of years now too. So he has some room to learn behind a guy that's learned behind one of the best in Poulin. So I think it's a really interesting dynamic, and it could be one of those situations, we talk about the PLO where you see the Archers go with Adam Gittleman and Drew Adams back and forth. It could be one where you see Kevin Orleman in there one game, you see Nick Demuth in there another game, and they flip-flop back till they find their guy. So that's really interesting to me to see, but I think those two are the bread and butter of what we're going to get out of this goalie class.
I think, though, a lot of San Diego people were wondering why they protected Frank Chiliano instead of Nick Demuth because he was the younger body. I think not having played a lot of senior ball and only those 8 games in the NLL really hurt Nick Demuth, but I don't think it's because he's a bad goaltender or they don't have a lot of high hopes for him. They just felt more comfortable keeping Frankie, knowing his body work. We use that term a lot when we talk about expansion tests, but his body work has definitely allowed him to be that guy for San Diego to keep. We mentioned the whole Chris Corbeil situation kind of early on and picks and flips or whether you're going to sign a for UFA. So we're not going to really focus on him with Saskatchewan. We went with Matt Hossack because we're not going to make that deal, right, Pat?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you can make that deal, that's great. But I just think there's far too many factors. I think that's why we went with Matt Hossack. And this is a situation where you could draft, Chris Corbeil, and then you end up getting Matt Hossack in return with some picks as well. So, and if you can get a guy like Matt Hossack, that's great. I think Matt Hossack, the fact that his brother is Graham Hossack, the best defender in the game, he doesn't quite get the respect that he deserves. Because let's be honest, he's not his brother, but he's a pretty damn good ball player as well. And he's played in a defensive system in Saskatchewan that doesn't really allow too many defenders to kind of shine, because it's just, you play within your system, you do your job, you move the ball up the floor, and you get off. Unless you're one of those transition guys like the Cornwalls, like the Corbeils that are running the ball up the floor and scoring. If you're one of those low defenders, you're just doing your job and you're collecting championships, which is a pretty good trade-off, I would say. Yeah. And I really do like what Matt Hossack does bring in, the fact that, he is training with his brother in the offseason. Obviously not this year with, Graham playing the PLL, but these are guys that they compete against each other. They're literally at their farm throwing bales of hay.
Playing dodgeball with bales of hay.
Exactly. These are absolute freak athletes. And I think Matt is a guy, like I said, he just doesn't get the respect because of his big bro. And I think if he does kind of get an opportunity where he's in a system that maybe he can be, instead of a depth guy, be a guy that's near the top of the depth chart, maybe we'll be able to see him shine a little bit more.
Audie, to your backyard and the Toronto Rock, you've watched this club and covered them for the last few years, even since you were just a wee tot with puka shells. They have a lot of UFAs unprotected. Is there a chance that Bob Hamley goes after one of them?
I would love to say yes, because there are a lot of quality players, but it's the same situation that Halifax is in when it comes to the Rock. Dan Dawson's out there. He's a UFA, and he's also over 35, so he can turn down the franchise tag, which he would, because he likes being home. The ones that we were looking at before we realized they were UFAs were your Damon Edwards, your Billy Hallstrassers, those kind of players. And I think the main one that I looked at under different circumstances that I would have taken a run at is Adam Jones. The main issue is that he's a teacher, which makes his schedule kind of difficult, and that's been pretty publicized at this point. The other issue is when he's been in the lineup for the Rock. I shouldn't say when he's been in the lineup, when he's been healthy. It hasn't been very often, unfortunately. He's had a bad run of injury troubles putting him in and out of the lineup with the Rock, which is unfortunate to see, because he fills the net when he's on the floor with Hellier and Schreiber. So a long-winded way of getting around to it. But I think the one guy that we were kind of interested in seeing is TD Ierlan. We've seen his resume and what he's done in the PLL this year. I think the main thing against him is that he's about 5'9", 170, 5'10", 170. He's not exactly a big frame, so I don't know if you could, like a Baptiste or somebody like that, if you could trust him to go out and body up somebody on the defensive end. So with that being said, I think the easiest pick here is, the obvious one for me, at least, is Scott Dominey. And he's a guy that didn't come out of nowhere, but, came out of nowhere in a sense. He was a guy that was sort of an interesting contributor for the Rock, because he came in with not a lot of fanfare. And we talk about how quick Joey Capito is in transition. Scott Dominey is up and down the floor like at a ridiculous rate. He can get down the floor like crazy. He runs his ass off the entire game. He's in your face, which a lot of teams love. My dog has some high hopes or some hot takes on the Rock as well. But yeah, Dominey's 23 years old. Like, he's sort of that perfect guy that's had the NLL experience, not a lot of it, but enough to get by. He's a threat in transition. He's not afraid to scrap on defense. And he's young enough where he's still able to learn. He's still able to go through and, take that next step and have that ceiling. I don't know how high the ceiling is, because he was a mid-round pick. So it's kind of hard to say that, he's going to be the next Graham Hossack or something. I'm not going to make that. But could he be a guy that's really gritty on defense and be a solid transition threat? Absolutely. And he could be a damn good one when it comes to it.
So not Paul Rabel.
Not Paul Rabel, not this time. Next year.
Right, next year. The last team is Vancouver. And this is a team that has a lot of guys based on the West Coast, a lot of older guys, but they do have some young, unproven guys coming up. This is a team in an area where I think a sign and trade or a flip and pick might be very likely. I originally kind of thought Chris O'Doherty, being an American guy that has tons of box experience, really fits in. The lure of Justin Salt is sitting right there. But if you're taking Salt, you're probably going to flip him back for picks. But Vancouver doesn't really have a lot of pick asset, nor do they have a lot of player asset that Panther City would want. So this might be one of the toughest selections out there, Patty.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You flip-flop. A name that kind of went out was Christian Mazzone, and I think he's another. Like, he's a guy that if he hops in the box and we see a similar game that we do see out of him in the PLL, by all means, you would love to pick him up. But at the same time, you've never seen that body of work. So I think a guy that we've talked about a lot about ceiling and the potential and what you think maybe one day you can get. Well, this guy, I think Brandon Goodwin is who we went with. He's about 30 years old. You know what you're getting out of him. He's a hard-nosed player. He can move the ball up the floor. And, when we were going through this list, I didn't even realize that just, in 2018, he had 26 points in 18 games. So he obviously shows that he does have a lot more transition upside than we maybe have seen in the last couple of years. So I think maybe with a new change of scenery, maybe he can get back to being a little more of a transition threat. So he's a guy that I think, he can play offense, he can play defense. I think he's a guy that, again, you pick and plug, and you can never go with those guys that are versatile, that can play both sides of the floor.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what they do. Jordan McBride's another name that we didn't really touch on, but he was a 2.5 goal a game guy for most of the season for Vancouver. He had a string of hat tricks. Like, that guy is a very talented player. He's been in the league for a long time. Might be a very alluring pick, but again, I think whoever they take from Vancouver, Dan Richardson is going to do everything in his power to probably try and get him back. So
yeah,
that's 13 picks. That's 13 guys. That's a pretty good start, even from our list to what the eventual list is going to be. We can all agree that Panther City isn't going to be your run-of-the-mill expansion club, I don't think.
No, absolutely. And I think that in order to be a successful franchise from a marketing standpoint, let's be honest, winning sells tickets. And, the game can be as exciting as it is, but if the home team's not coming out at least being competitive or coming out with victories, it's going to be hard. So I think the way that the league has done a very good job allowing these teams to be competitive, it's not a super unfair advantage where teams are getting purged with their young talent away. Luckily, though, their teams have to be happy that there's only one team being drafted this year, because in years past, there's been two. So teams have been really plucked apart. So I think this is a healthy balance between allowing a new team be able to be competitive without teams losing two players, because could you imagine if some of these teams were losing two guys off these lists? That would be very detrimental.
Yeah, if Vegas was coming in this year, we would be having twice as long of a talk as we'd be having now. Audie, obviously this draft today is going to set Panther City ahead for the future. But what does the future look like for this club, do you think? What's the plan 2-3 years down the road?
I think it's to, give these guys as much of an opportunity to succeed as possible. These young guys, have them learn behind the veterans, and you have one of the best coaching staffs in the league, honestly, with the group they've put together. And I think I don't know, it's tough because you want to add as much talent as possible, but you have to do it the right way. You have to add through the draft. And I think that's how they're going to do most of it, is adding through the draft. But New York went out after year one, saw what they were doing, and grabbed Callum Crawford, and then also had Tyson Gibson and Jeff Teat. So it's looking up for them, and Jim Veltman's certainly done a good job. I'll give a shout out to Scoop real quick. But I think if they could do that, that would be fantastic. I don't think you're going to have an MVP candidate fall into your lap after year one, but I could be wrong. Who knows? But I think, it'll be a little bit of adding through the draft. It'll be, some free agent additions. I don't know if it'll be a bunch of guys that'll, make them a contender overnight, but Rome wasn't built in a day. So
I think if they do well in this expansion draft and build a pretty good model, that will become more alluring come August 1st for some of those unrestricted free agents, that they can say, hey, look at our foundation that we have right now.
Yeah.
And we're going to add you, and they're probably going to have a game plan. They're going to say, we're going to go after you. We're going to go after these three other guys in free agency. We're going to get this guy in the draft. Like, they have the first overall pick coming in. So they're going to get, either a Ryan Lanchbury, a Jonathan Donville. Like, they're going to get a stud right out of the gate. So this draft today is hugely important for the fact of going into free agency. They can say, hey, look what we have right now. Come be a part of that. And I don't know if they're going to be, a San Diego finishing second in their first year, hosting a playoff game right away. They're stepping into a very competitive Western division. And it is going to be tough for them. But I think, like we talked about, this coaching staff isn't going to want to succeed or settle for mediocrity. They are going to want to be competitive right out of the gate. And I think the future really looks bright for them.
It does. And I think you obviously, when you get that core and you can market, look at what we have, look at the draft picks that we have, but also, I've been down to Fort Worth before. That arena is unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
The Fort Worth, Dallas area is one of the largest growing metropolises in the U.S. Like this is a great situation to not only just bring in players to play here, but it's a great opportunity to bring some of these young guys in to live down there full time. Really grow the game and grassroots level, because as you guys know, without that grassroots growth, the success of a fan base is really, really going to be difficult. And you look at all these new expansion teams, the ones that are having a lot of success. I mean, you look at San Diego, what they've been able to do as well. So that's something that is very intriguing for me. And one thing before we do go here, I think another no-brainer for me is you got to sign Bryce Wasserman. Texas boy, you have to sign him in free agency. He's a big body. He's not afraid to get hit. I think giving him a shot inside the box, and then that's a marketing tool right there.
He's from the area,
Texas
right?
born. He's from North Texas. Just a couple hours out. You have him in market. A home. You could say to these kids that are playing lacrosse in Texas, look at this guy.
Yeah.
He's a guy that, was a football player that turned into a lacrosse player. Look what he's able to do. And I think, like I said, his skill set actually kind of lends pretty well for the box game as well.
Guys, this has been fantastic. Obviously, we're the experts, so we're going to get every pick right. So, Bob Hamley, you don't even need to go on with the presser. Send Devin back to Philadelphia. All your dignitaries, just let them go to the after party. We're going to get a lot of picks wrong.
It's going to be a bloodbath.
Yeah, and that's how these mock drafts go. Everyone loves them, but they hate them all at the same time because and this is a line that every GM has given me that I've talked to. They're not going to believe what they hear until Bob Hamley says the name. So let's all sit back and enjoy. He's Austin Owens _ Austin Owens 1. He's Pat Greggy, Pete Greggy. I'm Teddy Jenner. Find me at Off the Crossbar. Enjoy the draft. And thanks for tuning in, everybody. This has been Lacrosse Flash Mock Draft.